So hi everybody, today I'm really honored to have the possibility to have a chat with Professor Tyrell, who is one of our distinguished guests at this incredibly inspiring conference on the global outreach of Theodore Roosevelt. And Professor Tyrell, you have been writing extensively on this topic, and I wanted to ask you something that in our discussion hasn't come up yet, and it's the role of Theodore Roosevelt in the invention of the global environment.
Well, that's something that I've written a whole book about, the crisis of the wasteful nation, conservation, or empire and conservation in Theodore Roosevelt's America. Sorry, I've got that wrong. I think that Roosevelt was a real pioneer in trying to develop a world consciousness about the dangers of environmental waste, of overuse of resources, of the need to conserve resources of all kinds, whether it be natural resources or what is normally called natural resources or human resources, and that he worked from the national level on this first, particularly in the period from 1908 to 1909, in the very end of his presidency, and then onto an international stage. Now, he wanted to strengthen the American national environment, and he was involved in the passage of various laws and executive orders which achieved this aim, notably for the creation of national parks and forest reserves. But in 1908, he also held a national conference, a National Conservation Congress, which was to audit all of the resources that were available in the American nation, and speakers gathered from around the country to discuss this and to illustrate the need for conservation of resources, which not only meant animals and plant life, but also things like coal and iron that have subsequently become so important in our modern discussions of environmental damage and the question of climate change. So he was involved in this along with his very close lieutenant in domestic policy, that was Gifford Pinchot, or Pinchot as he preferred to be called. And Pinchot was really an inspiration to Roosevelt. They thought very much alike on this issue, and they decided that it would be important to internationalize this movement, having already built a foundation at the national level. And this international movement began with the holding of a North American Conservation Conference in Washington in 1909, just before the end of Roosevelt's presidency. And represented there were Canada, the Dominion of Canada, Newfoundland, which was at that time separate, the United States, and Mexico. And it was a very cordial meeting, and a declaration of the need for the protection of natural resources was agreed to at the end of that. Then Roosevelt, with Pinchot urging him on, decided to call an invitation for an international or world conservation conference, which would be held in The Hague in the Netherlands at some future date. And invitations went out, but by that time Roosevelt then ceased to be president. It was at the very end of his period in office, and things were sort of left hanging at that point. And his successor, William Howard Taft, decided not to proceed with that conference, but 29 nations had already accepted the invitation. So there was a start made towards international conservation. Pinchot continued to push this issue in later years, right up to after the Second World War, and it was quite important in the development of the international conservation movement, which led to the eventual founding of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature after World War II. Meanwhile, of course, Roosevelt went on to Africa to hunt animals, ostensibly to gather information about various species and to send specimens back to Washington and other places in the United States, as others among the great white hunters had done or were to do. But Roosevelt also continued to carry this message of global conservation when he went to Europe. He went to Europe after the trip to Africa, and in Berlin he spoke about the world movement, a world movement which would include the conservation of all resources. So that was a very powerful message that he put, and I think in many ways it was as powerful as his more famous address in Paris, which is commonly referred to as the man in the arena speech. I think in the world movement speech we see Roosevelt continuing on in the tradition. It wasn't just something that was needed to be put forward during his presidency, but also it must continue on to success in the future. Now, he never got to be president again. At that time, there was no rule against him running for president again, and he was dissatisfied with Taft, and he did run, but he didn't win in a split vote in 2012, and that was more or less the end of his political activity. He did hope for future political activity, but nothing much happened. From that point on, he just becomes an influence. He's a tradition. He's established a tradition that conservation is not only to be national, but it must be global as well.
Thank you,
Is that
Professor.
okay?